Some nurses think combat medic training makes them doctors. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 14 minutes before the 300-pound armed man walked through the ER doors. Hannah Clarke did not flinch. She did not pause. She continued restocking the crash cart as though the words had passed through empty air, and the trembling in her hands, the trembling that wanted to come, that she would not allow, stayed locked inside her chest where no one could see it. It was 2:27 a.m. at Cedar Creek Medical in Portland. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless, soulless rhythm above the supply room where Hannah worked her 5th double shift in 8 days, counting the rolls of gauze, checking the expiration dates on medications, her movements economical and precise like someone who had learned long ago that wasted motion was the difference between a patient living and a patient dying. The antiseptic smell clung to her scrubs. It always did. After 3 years at Cedar Creek, the smell had become part of her skin. She was 34 years old and no one at this hospital knew anything about her. That was exactly how she wanted it. The ER beyond the supply room doors held 23 people waiting, a woman with chest pain who'd been triaged at 11 p.m., a construction worker with a laceration that needed 12 stitches, an elderly man coughing fluid into a tissue. Normal night. Routine. Safe. Hannah had learned to move through Cedar Creek Medical like a ghost, present but unnoticed, her badge reading RN, 3 years, in a font so small that most people never bothered to look closely enough to read her name. The hospital's chief of surgery definitely never had. Dr. Caldwell had stopped her in the corridor at 2:33 p.m. that afternoon, not to speak to her but to speak through her to 2 board members whose names she did not know and would never know. He had positioned himself near the vending machine, voice just loud enough to carry, the way men of a certain kind of power always knew exactly how much volume was required for maximum damage. Some nurses think combat medic training makes them doctors, he had said, laughing, a sound like gravel in a blender. They watch a few YouTube videos, get some ideas above their station. Next thing you know they're making treatment calls they have absolutely no business making. Hannah had been restocking the crash cart 3 feet away. Shoulder to shoulder with the emergency equipment, the defibrillator pads, the endotracheal tubes, the medications that kept hearts beating when they wanted to stop. She had not turned. Had not acknowledged that she had heard him. Had simply continued placing sterile gauze packets into their slots, her jaw tightening imperceptibly, the muscles in her forearms going tight as steel cables beneath skin scarred with half-faded marks from surgeries and shrapnel and things that happened in places that did not officially exist. Her face had shown nothing. That was the discipline that kept her alive. But now, alone in the supply closet 30 minutes later, with the door closed and the rows of medications and instruments surrounding her like witnesses, Hannah gripped the edge of the metal shelf until her knuckles went white. The shelf was cold. Industrial. It smelled like metal and cardboard and the faint medicinal tang of years of stored pharmaceuticals. Her jaw clenched. Her breathing came measured and controlled, the breathing she had learned in a place called Baghdad, during a mission that had no name and a unit that had no official designation, when learning to breathe through rage was the difference between keeping your weapon steady and losing your operational effectiveness. She released the shelf. Smoothed her scrubs. Checked her reflection in the small mirror taped to the inside of the door, something that had been there longer than she had. The woman looking back at her was invisible. Unremarkable. A nurse with tired eyes and steady hands. Just a nurse. That was what Caldwell saw. That was what everyone at Cedar Creek saw, and she had spent 3 years making certain that was all they would ever see. The shelf had left red marks on her palms. She flexed her fingers until the color faded and the marks disappeared, then returned to inventory. Inventory was safe. Numbers were safe. The sodium chloride for bags were counted. The morphine was logged. The chest tube trays were restocked with 28-gauge and 32-gauge needles, the kind she could place blindfolded, the kind she had placed in conditions that would have made most trauma surgeons' hands shake so badly they could not hold a pen. At 3:15 a.m., the ER called for assistance with an incoming patient, a 47-year-old male, blunt force trauma to the chest, possible tension pneumothorax, ETA 7 minutes. Hannah moved into Trauma Bay 3 with the resident physician, a man named Dr. Patterson, who was competent enough but whose hands moved with the hesitation of someone who had learned emergency medicine from textbooks rather than from having actually held someone's open chest in his palms while rounds of automatic fire tore through the walls of a field hospital. The patient arrived via ambulance at 3:22. The stretcher wheels squeaked against the tile floor like something dying. The paramedics gave their report: motorcycle collision, driver ejected, 30 meters, didn't get up, breathing shallow, O2 sat at 84% and dropping. Patterson's hands moved, but his movements lacked decisiveness. The needle decompression at the second intercostal space needed to happen now. The positioning had to be exact. The subclavian artery could be punctured in the hands of someone who did not know exactly where they were going. Hannah had stepped in without waiting to be asked. Her hands had moved on their own, muscle memory taking over, the kind of muscle memory that came from doing something thousands of times in conditions that made a Portland Trauma Bay feel like a vacation resort. The needle, a 14-gauge angiocath, had found its space between the ribs with a kind of precision that made a veteran Army Ranger who was waiting in the bay for his own laceration repair watch from the doorway with his eyes going very still. The air hissed out. Sinus rhythm. The patient's oxygen saturation climbed, 84%, 87%, 91%. Stable. The Ranger patient's name was Marcus, according to his wristband. He had done 3 tours in Helmand Province with the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines before an IED had taken his left leg below the knee. He watched Hannah clean up after the procedure, watched the way she moved, the way her fingers worked with the kind of economy and precision that did not come from a nursing school in Oregon. When she was back in the corridor, heading toward the supply closet to document what had been used and needed to be restocked, Marcus had caught her elbow gently. Not grabbing. Just touching. A soldier's touch, careful and respectful. "I've only seen Special Forces medics work that clean," he had said quietly. His voice was soft. His eyes were older than his face. "Who were you really?" Hannah had paused for exactly 2 seconds. Her jaw had tightened the same way it had tightened at the vending machine. Her hands had remained perfectly steady. "Just a nurse," she had said, and then she had continued walking, her pace exactly the same as before, her breathing exactly the same, and Marcus had not asked again because he was a soldier and he understood that some questions did not get answered. The rest of the night continued the way all nights at Cedar Creek continued. Patients arrived. Patients were treated. Patients were either admitted or discharged or, very rarely, did not leave at all. Hannah moved through all of it like water moving through a filter, present, necessary, invisible. At 6:41 a.m., when her shift ended, she clocked out, walked to the employee parking garage, and unlocked the trunk of her car. The combat boots were still there. Tan leather, salt-stained from dust that had been Iraq and dust that had been Afghanistan. The laces were frayed. The heels were worn down from kilometers and kilometers and kilometers of walking through places where every shadow could be an insurgent and every civilian could be carrying a detonator. She closed the trunk without touching them. She would not wear those boots again. She could never wear them again. They belonged to someone who had died in a place that had no official name, executed by a 2-star general's order because that person knew something that threatened something larger than her own survival. That person had been erased from every database. Scrubbed from every record. Given a new social security number and a new date of birth and a new name that looked nothing like the one her parents had given her. The boots were the only thing she had carried out. The only proof that the woman who had worn them had ever actually existed. Hannah Clarke, RN, did not exist in any meaningful way. She was a ghost with a paycheck and a badge, and as long as she kept her head down and kept doing the work that saved lives in the small hours of the morning when the world was not paying attention, that was all she would ever need to be. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Caldwell had just started paying attention, and men like that, once they noticed something wrong, did not stop until they had either fixed it or destroyed it. The amphitheater at Cedar Creek Medical smelled like floor wax and stale coffee. 40 residents sat in descending rows, their attention focused on the projection screen where Hannah's own handwriting appeared, magnified to grotesque proportions. Her patient notes. Her abbreviations. Her documentation from 3 nights ago, a stable post-op patient, vitals within normal limits, chest tube output minimal. Straightforward. Competent. Done. Dr. Caldwell stood beside the screen with a laser pointer, its red dot circling her words like a predator marking prey. His voice carried the polished authority of a man who had never been questioned. This, he announced, tapping the pointer against her notation, is what I call dangerously abbreviated documentation. Nurse Clarke here believes that the PT stable, vitals WNL constitutes adequate charting. Perhaps in a field hospital, this passes muster. But at Cedar Creek Medical, we maintain standards. Laughter rippled through the residence. The sound moved through the amphitheater like a wave, and Hannah felt every pair of eyes shift toward the back where she stood, half hidden in shadow. She did not flinch. She did not blink. Her jaw tightened imperceptibly, the only concession her body made to the humiliation. Her hands remained at her sides, steady as surgical steel. Her face showed nothing. Nothing at all. She continued standing in the same exact position, her breathing even and controlled, as if Dr. Caldwell had commented on the weather rather than dismantled her competence in front of the hospital's future surgeons. Caldwell continued for another 8 minutes. He pulled up 3 more of her charts, each one projected and dissected, each one followed by suggestions that her training was insufficient, her attention to detail lacking, her understanding of proper medical documentation fundamentally flawed. The residents took notes. Some nodded. One woman in the front row glanced back at Hannah with something that looked like pity. Hannah's eyes remained fixed on a point on the wall behind Caldwell's head. Not looking away. Not appearing angry. Appearing, instead, like a woman made of reinforced concrete, present but unreachable, there but not truly there at all. When grand rounds ended, Caldwell stepped directly into her path as she walked toward the exit. Nurse Clarke. A word. It wasn't a request. It was a command dressed in civility. The residents flowed around them both, their chatter fading down the corridor. Of course, Doctor, Hannah said. Her voice was neutral. Professional. I've noticed you've been taking extended breaks during your shifts, Caldwell said, his tone conversational now, the cruelty of the amphitheater replaced with something more insidious, the careful precision of a man documenting a problem for future reference. Security will be monitoring your badge swipes going forward. We wouldn't want to escort you out for time theft, would we? He smiled. Not warmly. I'm sure we can avoid that unpleasantness. An orderly passed them in the hallway, his cart squeaking slightly on the linoleum. He heard every word. Hannah met Caldwell's eyes. Her stare was flat as tempered glass. Understood, Doctor, she said. Nothing more. Nothing less. No defensiveness. No explanation. Just acknowledgement, delivered in a tone that made it clear she was accepting information, not apologizing. She turned and walked away before he could respond. That afternoon, Caldwell stopped by the vending machine where Hannah was restocking the crash cart, a task he had specifically assigned to her after mentioning during a staff meeting that she seemed to have too much idle time on her hands. The reassignment had been swift and public, presented as a concern for her professional development rather than what it was, a diminishment. Busy work designed to occupy her hands and limit her access to the floor. Hannah was placing defibrillator pads into their slots, her movements precise and methodical, when she heard Caldwell's voice rise to deliberate volume. 2 board members stood with him, Harrison and Chen, both men with interests in the hospital's referral patterns and billing codes. The problem with hiring former military personnel, Caldwell said, glancing directly at Hannah as he spoke, is they often believe that a few months playing medic in some sandbox makes them qualified for real medicine. We have a nurse here who keeps questioning my post-op protocols. Thinks she knows better than a surgeon with 20 years' experience. He laughed. Confident. Unconcerned. It's the ego that comes with combat training, I suppose. One of the board members chuckled. The other one smiled. Hannah's hands continued placing the pads. Methodical. Steady. But her knuckles whitened against the metal edge of the crash cart, her fingers pressing hard enough that her nails began to leave crescents in her own palms. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the physical manifestation of a woman holding herself to a standard no one else in the room could comprehend, the standard that kept soldiers alive in kill zones and kept hands steady when everything around them was burning. Caldwell watched her for a moment longer, gauging whether his words had landed, then turned back to the board members and continued his conversation as if she had already ceased to exist. Hannah finished restocking the cart. She then walked to the supply closet, a narrow space lined with cardboard boxes and plastic-wrapped bundles of gauze pads. She closed the door behind her. Her hands were shaking now, tremors that had finally broken free from her control. She gripped the metal shelf in front of her, gripping it hard, gripping it until her whole body seemed to vibrate with the force of her own restraint. Alone. Finally alone. She allowed herself this, the physical manifestation of anger that she could never show anyone, the pressure that built behind her sternum like a decompression sickness, the weight of staying invisible while being made a spectacle. After 4 minutes, her breathing steadied. Her hand stopped shaking. She released the shelf and walked back out into the corridor as if she had simply been retrieving supplies. 2 weeks passed. Hannah worked her shifts, restocked her carts, and said almost nothing to anyone. But during the day's shift breaks, when she was supposed to be on the floor, she was instead in the administrative office reviewing supply requisitions, the task Caldwell had assigned her to keep her occupied and compliant. The billing codes were organized by procedure type. Post-op complication codes were organized by surgeon. The pattern was impossible to miss once she saw it. Dr. Caldwell's surgical patients showed complication rates of 18%. The hospital average was 4%. But the complications only appeared in specific billing codes, codes associated with complex procedures that required extended post-operative care. Longer stays meant more billable care. More billable care meant more money cycling through the system. Hannah photographed 3 pages of records on her phone, the camera flash dimmed, the images clear and time-stamped. She did nothing with the photos. She simply photographed them and walked back to her assigned duties as if nothing had changed. That same week, a patient arrived in the ER at 11:48 p.m. via ambulance. Marcus Webb, 52 years old, construction site accident, a steel beam had caught his chest, and the paramedics had done field treatment only. His oxygen saturation was 84% and dropping. His blood pressure was 102/61. The attending physician ordered immediate chest tube placement. Hannah was assigned to assist. She walked to the trauma bay where Webb lay breathing in sharp, painful gasps. The ER attending, a younger doctor named Morrison, was preparing the site. Hannah moved with the kind of fluid precision that came from having done this particular procedure not dozens of times but hundreds of times, and not in sterile operating rooms but in conditions where precision was the only thing standing between life and death. She positioned the patient. She prepped the site. She identified the third intercostal space, midclavicular line, the exact location where the needle would slip between the ribs. When Morrison handed her the chest tube, she inserted it with a single clean motion, the needle advanced, the guide wire followed, the tube secured. The hiss of air escaping. The immediate sound of relief. O2 saturation began climbing immediately. 84, 88. 92, 96. Stable. Webb watched her hands during the entire procedure, his eyes narrowed with recognition. As she was securing the dressing, his breathing finally even, he whispered so quietly that only she could hear, "I've only seen Special Forces medics work that clean." "Who were you really?" Hannah's hands paused for half a heartbeat. Her fingers stilled against the tape she was placing. But when she resumed, her movements were exactly as they had been before, competent, smooth, finishing the job with the same unmarked professionalism she applied to everything. "Just a nurse," she said quietly. Webb didn't believe her. She could see it in the way his eyes followed her as she moved away from the bed, the way his mouth opened as if to ask another question. But Hannah was already gone, already moving to the next task, already making herself invisible again. What happened next changed everything. But that morning, Hannah didn't know it yet. That same evening, Dr. Caldwell received a call from an administrator in the billing department. Hannah Clarke had accessed surgical records. Not on the trauma floor. Not in an emergency. During administrative hours. She had pulled up post-operative complication data and cross-referenced it against billing codes. The administrator had flagged it as unusual. Caldwell received the notification at 6:15 p.m., and his entire demeanor shifted in the space of a breath. He immediately scheduled a meeting with Harrison and Chen, the two board members who benefited most from his referral arrangements. He sat across from them in his office at Cedar Creek Medical, a room decorated with diplomas and photographs of him with local politicians, and he chose his words with the precision of a man who had learned to document his actions carefully. "We may have a liability issue with Nurse Clarke," he said. "I've noticed competence concerns. Abbreviated documentation. Questioning my clinical judgment. And now she's accessing billing records without authorization. I'm documenting everything. All of it. Just in case we need to move forward with a termination." Harrison and Chen exchanged a look. Both men understood exactly what was being communicated. The problem was being handled. The threat was being neutralized. Caldwell also made a phone call that evening to a private investigator whose number he had used before, a man named Graves who specialized in background checks and quiet investigations. "I need a complete background check on one of our nurses," Caldwell said. "Name is Hannah Clarke. Employment history, military service, everything. There's something off about her, and I need to know what it is before this becomes a legal issue." Hannah sat in the break room that night, eating a turkey sandwich alone, when she glanced through the window and saw Caldwell standing in the hallway speaking with a security guard. Both men turned and looked directly in her direction. Caldwell's eyes met hers for exactly 3 seconds. Then he turned away, speaking quietly to the security guard, his hand gesturing down the corridor toward the floor where Hannah spent her shifts. She set down her sandwich and finished eating mechanically, her mind already 3 moves ahead, already calculating trajectories and timelines and the ways that men like Caldwell, once they began moving against you, did not stop until they had either broken you completely or destroyed everything you had rebuilt. 2 weeks of double shifts. 2 weeks of scrutinizing supply requisitions at 3 in the morning, alone in the administrative office of Cedar Creek Medical, where the fluorescent lights cast everything in a sickly greenish hue and the hum of the building's ventilation became its own kind of white noise. Hannah had noticed the pattern first in the surgical documentation, not in what Caldwell wrote, but in what he didn't write. A post-op complication report flagged on June 14th. Another on June 19th. A third by June 26th. Each one followed the same arc: unnecessary procedure, post-operative infection requiring extended ICU stay, insurance claim submitted for both the original surgery and the extended care. The numbers didn't lie. A standard appendectomy ran $8,400. Caldwell's appendectomies ran $23,600, and somehow his patients developed staph infections at a rate that defied statistical probability. She'd cross-referenced the billing codes with the operative reports. The surgery descriptions were vague, too vague. Exploratory abdominal examination, tissue inspection, preventative intervention. Nothing specific enough to question, but nothing real enough to survive scrutiny. The insurance companies paid because the codes matched the claims. The codes matched because Caldwell had written them that way. Hannah traced the pattern backward through 3 months of records. 12 procedures. 11 post-operative infections. 37 days of unnecessary ICU admission. The total billing to insurance carriers came to $287,000. The actual cost of care was perhaps a tenth of that. During a routine supply order review on a Tuesday afternoon, she'd asked the question quietly. Just her and Michael Chen, the hospital's finance administrator, standing in the storeroom surrounded by cases of sterile gauze and boxes of latex gloves. The post-op complication rate in Caldwell's surgical suite is running about 92%, she'd said, her voice conversational, just making conversation the way tired nurses do when restocking. That seems unusual. Michael had looked up from his clipboard. His face had gone pale. Not defensive. Pale. The kind of pale that meant he already knew and had been hoping no one else would notice. He'd promised to look into it. He'd told her to keep quiet about it. He'd called Dr. Caldwell within the hour. By 11 p.m. that same night, Caldwell knew a threat existed. By midnight, he was activating channels Hannah didn't yet understand, a private investigator he'd used before for background verification, a phone call to the hospital administrator's office, a quiet conversation with one of the board members who'd joined him for a drink at his country club. The investigator's assignment was simple: find out who this nurse was and why she was asking questions about billing. Find out what she knew. Find out what she wanted. By 2 a.m., the investigator had reported back with a name and 15 years of employment history at Cedar Creek Medical, but nothing earlier. No college records. No prior employers. No childhood documentation. Just Hannah Clarke, appearing in the system in 2018 with a valid Social Security number and a nursing degree from Oregon Health Sciences University. No one simply appeared in the system. Caldwell understood the implications immediately. This wasn't a nosy nurse. This was someone who'd been given an identity, someone who'd been extracted from a previous life, someone operating under a level of government protection he didn't have the clearance to question. Which meant if he pushed too hard, if he made too visible a move against her, the wrong people might start asking questions about his own affairs. But it also meant that Hannah Clarke, if that was even her real name, existed in a bureaucratic void. No family to call. No professional references to revoke. No history that could be destroyed because there was nothing to destroy. The problem wasn't just that she discovered his billing scheme. The problem was that she could be made to disappear, and when she did, no one would come looking. The waiting room of Cedar Creek's emergency department at 2:51 a.m. held the particular desolation of late-night ER business: a mother with a feverish child slumped against a plastic chair, a man with what looked like a dislocated shoulder holding his arm gingerly, an elderly patient waiting for lab results, 3 visiting family members scattered in the corners pretending to sleep. The fluorescent tubes overhead buzzed their insectoid chorus. The coffee station in the corner exhaled the stale aroma of a pot that had been brewing since the night shift started. Hannah was behind the nurse's station, reviewing medication orders, when the automatic doors erupted open. Not opened. Erupted. The man was enormous, 6'2", easily 300 pounds, with a kind of muscular definition that came from either the gym or crystal meth or both. His pupils were dilated to the size of quarters. His skin was slick with sweat despite the cool hospital air. And in his right hand, held loosely but with absolute certainty, was a hunting rifle. Not a small gun. A serious rifle. The kind that was made to drop animals much larger than humans. "I need pain medication." His voice was raw, inhuman, the voice of someone whose vocal cords had been shredded by screaming or drugs or both. "Now! Somebody get me something for the pain." The waiting room detonated into panic. The mother grabbed her child and dove behind a cluster of chairs. The man with the dislocated shoulder bolted toward the bathroom corridor. One of the family members made a dash for the exit and collided with the automatic doors, which opened, then closed again, trapping him in the vestibule. The elderly patient tried to stand and fell back into her chair, her heart monitor's rhythm spiking on the staff station monitor, 120 beats per minute, then 130. The 2 security guards stationed in the ER did what they'd been trained to do in exactly none of their active shooter drills: they froze. Then they backed away, hands raised, moving down the corridor toward the administrative offices with the careful movements of men trying not to trigger a predator. One of them had a hand on his radio, calling for help, his voice steady enough but his eyes locked on the man and the rifle like a rabbit watching a snake. The man racked the bolt. The metallic clack of the rifle cycling echoed through the entire department, sharp and final, the sound of a loaded round being chambered. Several people who were still moving stopped. Several people who were standing sat down very quickly. The woman in the bathroom vestibule began to cry. Everyone was running. Everyone was screaming. Everyone was scrambling for cover or exits or phones to call for help that wouldn't arrive in time. Everyone except Hannah Clarke. She stepped out from behind the nurse's station with the same measured pace she'd used stepping out of Black Hawk helicopters in Kandahar province. Her hands were visible at her sides. Her face was neutral. Her eyes were tracking the man's center mass, but not in the way a frightened person looks, in the way someone looks when they're calculating angles and distances and the precise moment to move. "Sir," she said, her voice dropping into a register she hadn't used in 3 years. The register of someone who'd spent 12 years giving commands in the aftermath of explosions and ambushes and moments when hesitation meant death. It was a voice like a helicopter blade cutting through hot air, a sound that made the air pressure change around her. "I can see you're in pain." The man swung the rifle toward her. "Get back." His voice cracked. The gun wavered, but only slightly. His hands were shaking, but his finger was on the trigger, and the shaking made his aim worse, not better. "I don't want to hurt anybody, but I will. I will." Hannah kept walking. 15 feet became 10 feet. 10 feet became 8. Her pace never changed. Her voice never rose. "I'm a registered nurse," she said. "That pain you're experiencing, I can help. But I need you to lower the weapon first so we can talk." Every word was precisely placed, each syllable a brick in a wall of authority. The kind of authority that doesn't request, doesn't negotiate, states, "Stay back." The man's hands were shaking more now, the adrenaline and methamphetamine coursing through his system creating a feedback loop of fear and aggression. His eyes were darting toward the exits, calculating escape routes his panicked mind insisted he needed. But he didn't run. People high on crystal meth rarely ran from confrontation, they usually ran toward it, chasing the sensation. "I'm staying right here," Hannah said, and she did stop, about 6 feet away from him now, still too close to be safe but far enough to demonstrate she wasn't a threat. "My name is Hannah." "What's your name?" "Don't care. Pain medications work better when I know who I'm treating," she continued, her voice steady, conversational now, the voice of someone talking to a colleague over coffee. "So tell me your name, and tell me where the pain is, and I'll personally make sure you're taken care of immediately. That's a promise." 3 minutes. That's how long it took before the man's arms began to lower fractionally. Before his eyes stopped darting toward the exits. Before something in his face shifted from pure animal panic toward something closer to reasoning. The methamphetamine was still in his system, still firing neurons in random directions, but Hannah's voice had created a point of reference, a tether in the chaos. The investigator Caldwell had hired sat in the security office on the 3rd floor, watching the monitors, hand frozen above the emergency alert button. Dr. Caldwell stood beside him, watching Hannah's posture, her positioning, the precise angle of her stance relative to the rifle. "Call SWAT," Caldwell said quietly. "Already did," the investigator replied. "ETA 14 minutes. Then we wait," Caldwell said. But what happened next didn't end in 14 minutes. It ended in 4. The man's hands trembled on the rifle. 300 pounds of muscle and methamphetamine and 3 days without sleep, and his finger was inside the trigger guard. Security guards scrambled backward, radios crackling warnings, visitors diving behind plastic chairs. The emergency department fractured into panic, nurses pressing themselves against walls, a doctor freezing mid-stride, the fluorescent lights humming their oblivious mechanical rhythm above the chaos. Hannah Clarke didn't run. She didn't hesitate. She didn't calculate the odds. Her boots moved forward on the tile floor, 1 step, 2 steps, 3, crossing the distance between safety and the muzzle of a hunting rifle as if the weapon wasn't there at all. Her hands hung loose at her sides, palms visible, shoulders relaxed, every muscle in her body speaking a language that had nothing to do with fear. The man's eyes snapped to her. Red-rimmed. Dilated. Lost in the particular hell of methamphetamine psychosis mixed with chronic pain and 3 72-hour cycles without rest. "Don't come closer," he rasped, but his voice cracked on the words, a man issuing orders he no longer believed in. Hannah kept walking. "I said don't." "I hear you," she said. Her voice had dropped into a register that came from somewhere deeper than her chest. Not loud. Not aggressive. The tone a Master Chief Petty Officer uses in firefights when 30 seconds of clarity means the difference between an extraction and a body bag. Command without force. Authority without volume. The voice of someone who had stood in open fire and told panicked Marines to move, breathe, focus. I'm listening. Talk to me. The man's breathing hitched. His weapon wavered. Something in her tone, or perhaps in the absolute absence of fear from her posture, reached through the methamphetamine fog and found something human underneath. Nobody's helped me for 3 days, he said. Tears streamed down his face now, cutting through the grime on his skin. The pain, it won't stop. For minutes. That was how long it took. For minutes of Hannah standing at a distance that would let her move if he flinched, speaking in a voice like steel wrapped in velvet, speaking about pain as if she understood it at a cellular level, because she did. Pain was data. Pain was information. Pain told you what was broken and what still worked. She talked him down like someone who had been where he was, in the fractured dark spaces of the mind where nothing makes sense and everything hurts. I know, she said. You did the right thing coming here. Now do the next right thing. She extended one hand, palm up. Give me the rifle. He hesitated. She saw it in his shoulders, the weight of the choice, the last moment of defiance before surrender. And then his fingers loosened, fractionally, and Hannah moved. Her hands were faster than thought. She controlled his wrist with a grip calibrated to immobilize without breaking, applied a joint lock she had learned taking down insurgents twice his size in tight alleys in Fallujah, a technique that worked on physics, not strength. The rifle rotated away from her body, and he went to his knees not from pain but from the sheer inevitability of her technique. His body followed his arm because his body had no other choice. The weapon was in her hands before he could process what his own muscles had done. She cleared the chamber with the fluid precision of someone who could disassemble and reassemble and $416 in 7 minutes in absolute darkness. The round ejected with a sharp mechanical click. She removed the magazine. The smell of gun oil and spent powder hung in the air as she set both pieces on the floor, separated by 3 feet, rendered harmless in less than 4 seconds. Security rushed in then, boots pounding the tile, and tackled the man to the ground. Zip ties went on his wrists. He was crying harder now, pain and shame and relief all mixed together. Hannah stepped back. Her breathing was steady. Her heart rate had not spiked above baseline. She caught Dr. Caldwell emerging from his office, his face pale, his eyes moving from the disarmed man to the rifle on the floor to Hannah, still standing in the center of the emergency department like the eye of a storm that had just passed. My office, Caldwell said. His voice was cold. Calculated. Now. 20 minutes later, Hannah sat across from Dr. Caldwell and Margaret Pierce, the hospital administrator, a woman with iron-gray hair and the kind of exhausted expression that came from managing disasters. The termination letter lay on the desk between them, a single sheet of hospital letterhead that she hadn't picked up. You engaged with an armed subject without security clearance, Caldwell said, his tone the one he used in morning rounds when he was surgically dismantling someone's competence. You violated every protocol we have. You endangered patients, staff, and yourself. Effective immediately, you are terminated. This is non-negotiable. Hannah stared at the letter. She didn't pick it up. Her hands remained folded in her lap, steady as stone. I stopped him, she said. You created a liability, Caldwell snapped back. His fingers drummed against the desk, agitation beneath his professional veneer. This hospital cannot employ someone who acts like a vigilante. Security is reviewing footage, and I'm filing a formal complaint with the State Nursing Board for reckless endangerment and unauthorized use of force. He leaned back in his chair, and Hannah saw something shift in his expression. Something that looked like satisfaction. Like a man who had been waiting for this moment. I've also taken the liberty of initiating a comprehensive background investigation, he continued. Your employment history has some interesting gaps. 3-year absence between 2018 and 2021. No explanation in your file. No forwarding address. Your social security number shows government activity during that period, but no civilian employment records anywhere. That's unusual, Hannah. That's the kind of thing that makes people ask questions. The words landed like precision strikes. Hannah's jaw tightened, barely perceptible, but Caldwell saw it. He smiled. Security escorted you to your locker, Margaret said, her voice gentler but final. Your badge has been deactivated. We'll mail your final paycheck. You'll need to return all hospital credentials within 72 hours. Hannah picked up the termination letter. She scanned it once. 8 paragraphs of administrative language that translated into, "You no longer exist here." She stood. Is there anything else? The police will want a statement, Margaret said. You're welcome to wait, or you can contact them yourself tomorrow. Either way, this ends today. Hannah walked toward the door. Oh, and Hannah. Caldwell's voice stopped her at the threshold. If I were you, I'd get my affairs in order. The state licensing board is very thorough. This investigation could take months. Months during which you can't work at any medical facility in Oregon. Or Washington. Or California, if the board decides to flag you nationally. She didn't turn around. She walked out of his office and down the corridor and through the emergency department where the man she disarmed was being transported to the psychiatric unit, where a Marine Corps guard was still staring at her badge as if it might tell him something true. She didn't make eye contact. She retrieved her personal items from her locker, 3 books, a photograph of her combat boots lined with sand, a water bottle, and left the facility. By 8 p.m., Hannah sat alone in her car in the dim Portland parking garage, the one beneath Cedar Creek Medical where she'd parked for 3 years. The engine was cold. The ignition key hung unused in her hand. Her forehead pressed against the steering wheel, and she breathed the smell of old leather and the faint scent of antiseptic that never fully washed out of scrubs. She had nowhere left to go. The general's order echoed in her mind, 12 years later, still precise and cutting, "You don't exist anymore, Master Chief. Surface, and you're done. You understand me." She understood perfectly. Her hands gripped the steering wheel until they ached, and the silence of the parking garage was the silence of a woman who had run out of places to hide. The morning newscast flickered across the lobby screen at Cedar Creek Medical at 7:42 a.m. Local anchor, standard coverage. Weather. Traffic. Then the footage changed. A drone camera panned across the rubble of a collapsed building in Baghdad, 2019. Mortar fire hammered the surrounding structures. Dust hung in the air like a curtain between 2 worlds. A woman emerged from the chaos. Dark hair tied back. Combat uniform. A Marine lay across her lap, shrapnel embedded in his shoulder, his left leg below the knee nearly severed. She didn't hesitate. Didn't flinch. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of a surgeon working under stadium lights, not gunfire. Hemostats. Tourniquet. Direct cardiac massage through the chest cavity of a second Marine whose pulse had flatlined. The broadcast showed the timestamp, 2 minutes 17 seconds elapsed. Then for more casualties arriving. She worked on all of them. Simultaneously. Alone. While rounds impacted concrete 3 meters from her position. 11 Marines. 2 diplomats. She saved all 13 in the span of 4 minutes and 31 seconds under sustained enemy fire. The retired Marine Corps guard working the front desk, a 73-year-old named Clayton with a jawline that could cut glass, watched the footage and went completely still. His jaw tightened. His hands clenched the desk edge until his knuckles went white. He stood slowly, walked directly into the administrator's office without knocking, and said one sentence. "The nurse you fired yesterday is Reaper 6. The room went silent. Not the quiet of confusion. The silence of a name that meant everything to the people who served. Reaper 6. A call sign whispered in military hospitals from Bethesda to San Diego. a Master Chief Petty Officer whose extraction from Baghdad had been classified so far above top secret that even her own unit file had been erased from existence. Within an hour, a Navy captain arrived wearing the dress uniform of the Naval Special Warfare Command. Not a request. Not a warning. He carried a folder that hadn't been declassified in 18 months. He walked directly to the hospital administrator's office and placed the folder on the desk without speaking. By 9:15 a.m., the administrator had summoned Dr. Caldwell to a meeting he didn't know he was already dead inside of walking toward. The office was packed. Hospital board members. 2 federal agents with the kind of stillness that came from having seen things that couldn't be unseen. Caldwell's own private investigator sat in a chair near the window, holding a second folder. Hannah Clarke stood against the wall, hands at her sides, her expression showing nothing. She was wearing her scrubs. She had come in for her shift knowing what was about to happen. Caldwell entered. His eye scanned the room quickly, calculating. For board members. 2 federal badges. The investigator. Hannah. His investigator. All of them looking at him with the kind of certainty that meant the walls weren't closing. They were already closed. What's this about? Caldwell's voice was measured, controlled, the voice of a man who had navigated institutional politics his entire career. The Navy captain didn't answer. He opened the classified folder and slid a photograph across the desk. Reaper 6, call sign Hannah Clarke, standing in full dress whites with a Navy Cross ribbon on her chest. The ribbon was blank, the medal itself had been awarded in a classified ceremony 23 months ago. Most of the world would never know her name. Most of the military already did. She worked 3 years at your hospital without incident, the captain said. His voice was like a tank idling in a garage, quiet, but the power was always underneath. You investigated her. You fired her. You filed complaints with the state licensing board. You activated surveillance protocols. You hired a private investigator to dig into a work history that doesn't exist in any civilian database because it was erased for national security purposes. Caldwell's face began to pale. I didn't know. I'm aware, the captain interrupted. Which is why you're not under federal arrest at this moment. A former SEAL patient stood from a chair in the back corner. His name was Martinez. He had admitted to Cedar Creek 3 weeks ago with a bacterial infection from a contaminated water crossing in Honduras. Hannah had saved his life with antibiotics, precision care, and the kind of instinctive medical intuition that came from having performed emergency surgery in conditions that would have broken most people. Martinez walked forward and stopped directly in front of Dr. Caldwell's desk. Master Chief Clarke took shrapnel meant for my convoy, he said. His voice was steady, measured, the voice of someone who had testified before military tribunals. I watched her pull it out of her own shoulder and keep working on the Marines she was treating. She carried 2 wounded operators through a minefield, blind navigation, no thermal, no support, and got them to the extraction point still breathing. She's got a Navy Cross they can't publicly award her because the mission officially never happened. And you tried to destroy her because she questioned your billing practices. The room held its breath for 10 seconds. Silence so thick you could operate in it. Every eye turned from Hannah to Dr. Caldwell. His face had gone the color of old paper. His hands trembled slightly as they gripped the desk edge. There must be a mistake, he stammered. I can explain. You can explain this, Caldwell's own investigator said, standing and placing a second folder on the desk. He looked like he wanted to leave his profession that very moment. 47 unnecessary surgical procedures over 18 months. Kickback arrangements. Falsified post-operative documentation. Billing codes that don't match the procedures you actually performed. He laid printed documents across the conference table with the precision of someone placing evidence in a court proceeding. Your signatures. Your authorization codes. The referring physicians, who include 2 people in this room. The 2 board members Caldwell had been cultivating as allies stood abruptly. Their faces had shifted from confusion to the calculating expression of people realizing that association with him was now a liability. "We had no knowledge of any kickback arrangement," one of them said immediately. His voice was the voice of a man about to hire a very expensive lawyer. "Your signatures are on the referral agreements," a federal agent said, not looking up from the documents. The tone suggested this conversation was over. "Fraud conspiracy requires knowledge of the conspiracy. Your signatures provide that knowledge." Caldwell stood. His jaw tightened. His eyes moved to Hannah. For a moment, something flickered across his expression, not fear, but the realization that he had just spent the last 14 days investigating the wrong enemy. "You did this," he said to her. "You planted evidence, you manipulated the records." Master Chief Clarke flagged a supply discrepancy 14 days ago, the administrator said, reviewing her own notes. "A pattern of surgical requests that exceeded statistical probability for the patient populations being treated. She reported it through proper channels. I initiated an internal audit. Your own request for an investigation into her background triggered the fraud detection system. You investigated her, and you exposed yourself." The federal agents exchanged a look. One of them spoke into a radio attached to his jacket. 3 minutes later, another agent entered with a sealed box containing Caldwell's personal files. Over the next 3 days, the machinery of institutional consequence moved with the precision of a military operation. The state medical board launched a formal investigation. The 2 board members resigned before they could be fired. Federal agents seized Caldwell's entire computer system. Patients began filing lawsuits. The hospital suspended him pending termination. Then criminal charges were filed. Caldwell hired a lawyer. He couldn't afford the lawyer. He hired another lawyer. That lawyer couldn't afford to keep the case, so he hired a third. His wife left on day 7. His country club membership was revoked on day 9. Colleagues who once deferred to him began crossing the street to avoid him. A woman who had been his patient approached him in the grocery store parking lot and told him that the unnecessary surgery he had performed on her mother had caused permanent nerve damage, that she had paid $42,000 for a procedure she hadn't needed, that she hoped the trial would be very public. He didn't respond. He just got in his car and drove away. Hannah Clarke, meanwhile, was reinstated with full back pay and a formal apology from the hospital board. But reinstatement wasn't what the hospital had actually called her office to discuss. The administrator had offered her a position designing an entirely new initiative. A clinic dedicated to veterans. For former military personnel who had been failed by civilian medical systems, who carried trauma that only people who had served could understand, who needed a place where the word combat medic wasn't a liability but a credential. Hannah accepted without hesitation. The hospital allocated budget. Allocated staff. Allocated a private office on the 2nd floor with a window that faced the parking lot where she had pressed her forehead against a steering wheel 3 weeks ago, certain that every path forward had been burned behind her. That night, she drove to a storage unit in southeast Portland. She opened the trunk of her car and removed a pair of worn combat boots. They had carried her through Baghdad and back to the only battle that had ever truly threatened to break her. She brought them to the hospital. She placed them on the shelf above her desk, visible, no longer hidden, no longer the secret that defined her. For 6 months, Hannah Clarke ran Cedar Creek Medical's new veteran care clinic. She worked with a former Army Ranger named Marcus Webb who became her assistant director. Together, they created a space where PTSD wasn't a diagnosis but a recognized wound that needed time and expertise and understanding. Where the sound of a door slamming didn't mean immediate termination, where the presentation of combat trauma was met not with suspicion but with recognition. The walls of her office were covered with photographs of patients. Former Marines with their families. Navy SEALs who had finally found sleep again. Army Rangers who had learned to trust a civilian medical system. 43 people by month 5. 61 by month 6. Each one a reminder of what happened when someone who understood the cost of service was finally allowed to practice medicine without apology. The worn combat boots sat on the shelf above her desk, visible in open air, no longer the evidence of a hidden identity but a symbol that the people who had given the most could finally give again without fear. Across the city, Dr. Caldwell sat at a folding table outside a strip mall shopping center on Powell Boulevard. The table held pamphlets for supplemental insurance policies that middle-aged people might purchase because they were terrified of medical bankruptcy. His medical license had been revoked 3 months ago. His trial was scheduled for next month. His lawyer had recommended a plea deal, but the federal prosecutors weren't interested in deals. Former colleagues passed the table without acknowledgement. He watched them go, jaw tight, and didn't call out. He had no authority left to call with. A woman stopped at his table near the end of the afternoon. She was in her 60s, her face lined with the kind of exhaustion that comes from years of worry and financial strain. She looked at him for a moment, and recognition flickered across her expression. "You operated on my father," she said. "Coronary bypass. He didn't need it. He was asymptomatic. You billed us $40,000. His insurance denied half of it. We declared bankruptcy 6 months later. He died of a heart attack 3 years later anyway, and I spent every moment after that wondering if the surgery had damaged him, if that's why his heart finally failed." She didn't wait for a response. She walked away. Caldwell watched her go, and for a moment, his hands trembled. He gripped the edge of the table until the trembling stopped. Then he returned to his paperwork. The folding table creaked in the wind. The afternoon sun beat down on the asphalt. He sat alone, and the aloneness was complete. Back at Cedar Creek Medical, Hannah Clarke was teaching a training course for emergency department nurses. 20 of them sat in the conference room, learning de-escalation techniques that Hannah had developed from her experience and her training and the night she had walked toward a man carrying a rifle while everyone else ran away. "Panic spreads faster than fire," she told them, her voice steady and clear. "You've all seen it happen. One person gets afraid, they call for security, they move away from the patient, and suddenly everyone in the room is operating from fear instead of calm. Calm is contagious too. Choose which one you're going to spread." After the class ended, a sergeant named Davis approached her. Sergeant Davis worked security and had been present in the parking lot 3 weeks ago when the armed man had been brought down, when Hannah had been terminated, when everything had collapsed. "Master Chief, there's a situation," he said. "PTSD patient in Trauma Bay 3, refusing treatment, threatening to leave AMA. He's escalating." Hannah nodded and walked toward the Trauma Bay. She had done this before. She had done it under conditions far worse than this. Her door read Hannah Clarke, MSN, RN, Director of Veteran Services. Someone had taped a handwritten note beneath it, the handwriting careful and precise. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. Hannah passed it every single day, and every single day she believed it more. She entered the Trauma Bay. A man in his 50s sat on the examination table, his face tight with the kind of fear that came from having survived war and learned not to trust institutions. He saw her, and something in his expression shifted. Not recognition, exactly. But something like relief. "I'm Hannah," she said simply. "Former Master Chief, Naval Special Warfare Command. I understand you don't want to be here." His eyes met hers. Really met them. Saw them. "Talk to me," Hannah said. "Let's figure this out together." He did. And slowly, over the next 20 minutes, he let her help him. Because he knew, just by looking at her, that she had been where he was. That she had survived. That she understood. And that was enough to begin healing. Subscribe to Code Whisperers for more stories of the people you judged until you learned what they really are. Like this video if you've ever been completely wrong about someone. Comment below, have you ever misjudged someone and later discovered they were far more than you imagined?